Between the mountains of the east and the plains of the west, there lies a land forgotten by many, yet older than most of the kingdoms we know. This is Armenia, a small nation carved by stone and memory, where the shadow of Mount Ararat watches like an eternal guardian. Here, in valleys watered by the Araxes River, tribes once prayed to their gods of sun and storm. Empires came: Assyria, Persia, Rome, each leaving scars, each leaving whispers in the dust. And yet, the Armenians remained, a people stubborn as the rock of their homeland. It was here that the world's first Christian kingdom rose. Not in Rome, not in Byzantium, but in this hidden land of mountains. It was here that saints walked among soldiers, and that kings carried both the sword and the cross. But history is never kind for long. What rises must tremble, and what endures must suffer. Armenia would shine, then bleed, would build cities of 1,000 churches, only to watch them crumble into silence. And yet, across centuries of conquest, exile, and memory, the Armenian soul endured. A candle in the storm, a whisper in the night, a flame that refuses to die.
Between the stone-cold ridges and the sun-warmed valleys, there lies a land that learned to breathe in the thin air of history. The mountains lift Armenia like an altar, and Mount Ararat stands as both witness and warning, a giant of memory looking down upon a small, persistent people. Here the wind is old. It has spoken with Assyrian charioteers, Persian couriers, Macedonian phalanxes. It has seen walls rise like prayers and fall like sand. And still the wind carries a fragrance of wheat and incense, a whisper that the world often forgets, yet cannot erase. Armenia. Long before the chroniclers wrote the word Armenia, there was Urartu, a kingdom of stone forts, cliff inscriptions, and silent citadels. They built with a tenderness for rock, as if every block of basalt were a covenant with the mountain. Lake Van mirrored their ramparts. The sky, in late autumn, turned brass above spear points. The gods were many, the rites severe, but the people steady, their labor engraved upon the hillsides as terraces and canals. In those years, the first rise of our tale seems almost inevitable, a highland state that harnessed water and iron, that planted itself like an eagle's nest between enemies who preferred plains. But the mountains do not protect forever. They delay. Assyria came with its cold arithmetic of power. The imperial ledgers of Nineveh listed the tribute expected, the prisoners taken, the gates opened. Urartu answered with defiance and fortifications, then with compromises, then with silence. The first fall arrives not as a single catastrophe, but as a sequence of surrenders, each one small, each one fatal. The forts remained, the sovereignty thinned. When the Assyrian thunder passed, it left behind not a corpse but a confusion. Peoples intermingled, languages crossed, bloodlines braided. From those braids, centuries later, Armenians would claim their lineage, not in purity, but in persistence. And yet, in the debris of kingdoms, identity is the one treasure that scavengers cannot carry away. The highland clans remembered their altars, their springs, their burial stones. They learned to bend without breaking. Some call them Nairi, some Hyasa, later Hay, the name they use for themselves. Shepherds by necessity, warriors by geography, traders by opportunity. They practiced the first law of the mountains. To endure is to win. This is our gentle rise again. Quiet, unheroic, and therefore durable. A people does not always resurrect with trumpets. Sometimes it wakes like a hearth coal at dawn, dull, warm, and utterly alive. The Persian world drew them into wider patterns. Under the Achaemenids, Armenia bore the yoke of a satrapy, and yet enjoyed the gifts of empire. Roads that stitched the highlands to Susa and Sardis, posts that galloped news faster than rumor, markets that welcomed wool, copper, timber, and wine. The great king demanded soldiers. Armenia sent them. Bowmen who could vanish among ridges, then reappear in volleys of thorns. Submission, yes, but not erasure. The local nobles kept their hill forts, their speech, their feasts that honored ancestors and hosts. In this balanced servitude, the people learned an art that would save them for 2,000 years, how to live between. AO2 would call it hill control. A village tucked upon a ridge, short on gold mines, long on vision, placing its first watchtower where paths converge, luring enemy scouts into uphill arrows. Armenia lived like that for ages, few in number, rich in terrain. If the plains were empire's chessboards, the mountains were Armenia's home map. A castle here is never just a castle. It is a proverb in stone. Hold the heights. And even a small garrison becomes a stubborn fact in a conqueror's day. Greeks came with other gifts. Philosophy as patient as winter, tragedy as clear as ice, stories of heroes who looked very much like shepherds with better armor. The Hellenistic winds arrived after Alexander, not as whips, but as perfumes, language, coins, city plans, a habit of debate. The Armenians took what fit and left what did not, adding a new glaze to an old clay. In the evenings of that age, one could imagine a hill village drinking Persian wine, telling Greek stories, counting taxes with Babylonian numbers, and still calling the valley by its own ancient name. To be Armenian became not a refusal, but a synthesis. Yet each gift mingled with a cost. Roads that brought trade also brought armies. Scripts that recorded contracts also recorded tributes due. The empire's peace was reliable until it wasn't. On some autumns the passes carried merchants, on others cavalry. And so the fall returns, not as tragedy but as tension, the kind that makes even weddings feel like armistices. A farmer sows barley, aware that in spring he may harvest war. A mother embroiders a cross upon a sleeve, not merely for faith, but for recognition if sons are lost among strangers. In those interims of calm, the highlands composed their temperament. Prudence became a civic virtue, hospitality a necessity for trade. Oaths the currency of clans too small for standing armies. If grandeur seldom visited, dignity did. The stones themselves instructed patience, snow taught economy, wolves sharpened watchfulness. Armenia, a cradle between empires, rocked not only children but character. The lullabies spoke of saints and swords, but in a tone so low that one could sleep to it. Cinema, if it could paint this chapter honestly, would not choose a final charge or a royal coronation. It would end on a close-up of hands, rough with soil, steady upon a plow, then upon a spear, then upon the lips of a child falling asleep beneath a roof of thatch and stars. The music would be strings, not drums. The light would be amber, a whisper of Ararat in the background, enormous yet somehow kind. From time to time a chieftain dreamed larger, a confederation, a border stronger than a ridge, a coin stamped with a name all could pronounce. Such dreams gathered like clouds. Some would break into storms in later chapters. Tigran the Great waits just beyond our horizon. But in this first epic, the people learn the hills better than they learn thrones. Sovereignty here is seasonal. Spring in one reign, winter in the next. What remains perennial is the village, the apricot tree, the cold spring, the chapel that used to be a shrine to other gods, and now is a house of the one God whispered in different tongues. And so we close this first movement with a rise, not triumphant, but resolved. Armenia has survived the Assyrian ledger, the Persian muster roll, the Greek vocabulary. It has worn each like a cloak against specific weather, never mistaking garment for skin. The people step carefully along ridgelines that are also timelines, everywhere a precipice, everywhere a view. The map shows borders, the mountains show paths, and the Armenians remember the paths when the borders change. Listen, the wind again. It carries a rumor of horsemen far away, and closer, the song of a shepherd whose flock bell answers the evening. Between them is history's true hour, the moment when a people chooses to endure rather than to be noted. Empires are the prose of power. Highlands compose the poetry of survival. Armenia has begun to write its poem, slow, stony, luminous at the edges. In AOE2 terms, the economy is modest but efficient. The villagers walk shorter paths. The lumber camp hugs the forest. The mill kisses the berries. A single outpost on a ridge sees farther than 10 on the flat. You will not yet see imperial age fireworks. You will see a patient feudal craft. Doors bar by night, trade carts by day. A monk learning letters that do not fully exist yet, because a script, Mesrop's gift, is still centuries away, sleeping like an idea under snow. Night falls, the highlands exhale. Ararat looms like a kindly giant in a child's dream, and the cradle between empires, rocked by conquerors, steadied by faith, weighted with memory, does not crack. It creaks and continues. Tomorrow there will be new banners on the horizon. Tonight there is only the hearth, the story, the mountain, and the knowledge that to live between is not to live less. It is to learn the art that kingdoms forget, and civilizations envy, how to last. History often spares small nations by hiding them. In valleys, in obscurity, in the margins of chronicles. But once in a rare age, fortune places a crown upon a forgotten head. And for Armenia, that crown rested on the brow of Tigran II, whom posterity calls Tigran the Great. He rose in 95 BC, a prince forged in captivity. Taken as a hostage to the Parthians in his youth, he learned their courts, their intrigues, their weapons. He returned to Armenia not humbled, but hardened. With patience, he took back his throne. With ambition, he took more than a throne. He took a vision. For the first time in centuries, the mountains dreamed not of survival, but of empire. The first rise of this chapter is dazzling. Tigran expanded swiftly, decisively. His armies marched across the highlands, then beyond. Soon, his domain touched the Mediterranean in the west and the Caspian Sea in the east. He ruled from the Taurus to the Caucasus, from Cappadocia to Mesopotamia. The world looked and marveled. Armenia, the cradle, the pawn, the hill fortress, had become an empire of plains and ports. At its heart stood Artashat, the capital he enriched, often called the Armenian Rome. Its streets bustled with merchants from Syria. Its temples glittered with gold. Its theaters echoed with Greek drama. Coins bore his face, soldiers his standard, and poets his praise. For once, the Armenians did not merely endure between empires. They created one. And yet, even in its ascent, shadows gathered. For to be great is to invite rivals. Tigran's Armenia, swollen with new lands, pressed too close upon both Rome and Parthia. He had inherited a lesson of his forefathers: never stand fully in the way of giants. But in glory he forgot. He married the daughter of Mithridates of Pontus, the eternal enemy of Rome. He allied with those who promised victories larger than wisdom could sustain. The second movement begins: overreach. When Rome finally turned its eyes eastward, it sent not one legion but many, under Lucullus first, then Pompey. Against such disciplined iron, Tigran's splendor trembled. His troops were brave but scattered, his nobles rich but restless. The empire he had built stretched wide, too wide for cohesion, too wide for loyalty. In the year 69 BC, Lucullus struck deep, seizing treasures, breaking armies. In 66, Pompey followed, and the dream of Armenian world power began to crack. The great city of Artashat, so proud in its theaters and temples, shuddered under Roman assault. Once it had been called a new Rome. Now it became a Roman target. Tigran fought, bargained, yielded. He bowed not as a broken king, but as a survivor, keeping a reduced Armenia as his realm. Still, the downfall was clear. The Mediterranean was lost. The empire of plains had shrunk back to mountains. What had begun as a miracle of expansion ended as a parable of ambition. Yet in this fall there remains something luminous. For even Rome, stern in its triumphs, admired Tigran's stature. Plutarch tells us he entered Pompey's camp dressed as a monarch still, offering his diadem, yet keeping his dignity. The Armenians remembered not only his empire, but his courage to endure loss with pride. To have dreamed once of empire was itself a kind of immortality. If this were Hollywood, Tigran's story would play like Gladiator. Imagine the wide panoramas of armies on dusty plains, the clash of legions and cataphracts, the grand halls of Artashat. The music swells with triumph, only to fade into exile, not victory. The hero walks not into eternal glory, but into history's twilight, carrying dignity but not dominion. It is less a triumph than a testament, less a coronation than an elegy. In AOE2 terms, Tigran advanced Armenia into a swift imperial age. Castles rose quickly, trade routes glimmered, cavalry thundered across the map. For a while it seemed unstoppable, a boom that outpaced rivals. But the economy spread thin, defenses neglected. Then came Rome, a disciplined, methodical siege civilization. Armenia's booming empire collapsed like a player caught out of position. Too many towns, not enough walls. And yet, even in defeat, the civilization survives. In the game, a player resigns and vanishes. In history, Armenia learned. The empire fell, but the people remained. Their dream of greatness burned into memory. Tigran gave his descendants not only ruins, but the knowledge that they could be more than a bridge. So ends the wave of this chapter. Glory and conquest, overreach and ambition, downfall before Rome, and beyond the fall, a quiet rise again. Endurance, memory, identity. For empires die, but nations endure. The sun sets upon Artashat, the streets grow silent, the crown of Tigran lies heavy in dust. But on the horizon, the silhouette of Ararat remains unchanged, watching, patient, eternal. Armenia has tasted empire, and though it will not hold it, it will never forget the taste. In the long corridors of history, nations often define themselves by swords, by banners, by the territory they seize. But once in a while, a nation chooses to define itself by something unseen, by faith. In the year 301 AD, Armenia did what no other kingdom had dared before. It became the first state to adopt Christianity as its official religion. Not Rome, not Byzantium, not even the Holy Lands of Judea, but Armenia, the small kingdom of mountains, made faith its fortress. The dawn of this chapter feels like a rise of light. Legend tells us of Gregory the Illuminator, a man once cast into a pit of snakes and darkness, emerging after years of torment with a vision brighter than iron could break. He baptized King Tiridates III, who had once persecuted Christians with fury. In that river of water and spirit, Armenia turned from altars of fire and idols of stone to the cross. The temples of the old gods, carved with pagan beauty, began to change. Some fell into ruin. Others were transformed into churches, their columns now bearing hymns instead of sacrifices. Pagan groves were cleared, sacred springs rededicated, festivals reimagined. Faith wove itself into the very fabric of daily life. Icons upon doorways, prayers whispered in vineyards, monks copying gospels upon lambskin in the glow of oil lamps. The land that had been a battlefield became a sanctuary. But no sanctuary is without shadows. The Persian Empire, still devoted to Zoroastrian fire, looked upon this Christian Armenia with suspicion. Faith to empires is never just faith. It is allegiance. To follow Christ was to turn away from the flames of Ahura Mazda, and to align, in spirit if not in arms, with Rome and Byzantium. Thus, the first persecution came not from pagans within, but from powers without. The second movement begins. Persecution. Persia sought to bend Armenia back to its fire temples. Edicts were issued, priests hunted, churches threatened. The famous Battle of Avarar in 451, though later, was foreshadowed in these tensions. Armenians clinging to their faith while armies demanded submission. The sword and the cross clashed not on parchment, but on fields where blood watered both wheat and memory. Many died not for gold or land, but for the right to make the sign of the cross. Yet persecution carries a paradox. The more the faith was struck, the deeper it sank roots. Martyrs became seeds, and their stories were sung by grandmothers to children by the hearth. The cross, carved upon the stone Kachkars, became a defiance that no decree could erase. What began as a king's decree grew into a people's identity. To be Armenian was no longer merely to speak a tongue or to till a valley. It was to be of the faith. And here the wave turns again. Resilience. Christianity did not wither in Armenia. It blossomed under pressure. Monasteries rose on mountainsides, precarious yet eternal. Monks withdrew into caves to preserve scriptures, creating a chain of hidden libraries across the highlands. Pilgrims found in Armenia not an empire of wealth, but a kingdom of faith. And in time, this identity proved stronger than walls, stronger than thrones, stronger even than empire. Imagine the cinematic scene. A pagan temple's fire extinguished at dusk. The next morning, sunlight falls through the same doorway upon a wooden cross. Children gather. Voices echo hymns where once priests chanted to gods of thunder. The camera pans outward. Mountains, silent and eternal, while below, a people begin to walk a path that will not end, even when kingdoms fall. It is less spectacle, more mystery, not gladiator, but something closer to the passion of Joan of Arc, where conviction itself becomes the drama. In AOE2 terms, this was the moment Armenia chose to convert, not an enemy city, but itself. Imagine the monk, staff in hand, chanting, and the villagers, one by one, turning from pagan to Christian. It is powerful, miraculous, but it is also risky. For in AoE 2, when you convert, you often pause your economy. You weaken your army. So too Armenia. In choosing faith, it gained identity but lost political neutrality. Surrounded by Zoroastrian Persia, pressured by Rome and Byzantium, the kingdom became vulnerable militarily even as it grew stronger spiritually. And yet, when the last fortress falls, what remains? Stones crumble, treaties fade, armies vanish. But faith endures. Armenia, by this single choice, inscribed itself into history not merely as a nation between empires, but as a nation of the cross. Thus ends the wave of this chapter. Spiritual light in Gregory's vision, persecution by Persia's fire, and resilience in a faith that would survive centuries of conquest. The candle, lit in 301 AD, still burns, its flame seen in every monastery ruin, every carved Kachkar, every Armenian heart scattered across the world. Night falls upon the valleys. The churches echo with quiet hymns. And above them, Ararat stands, as if crowned not with empire this time, but with faith. The mountain has seen kings come and go, but in this moment it watches the birth of something stronger than empire, gentler than armies, and far more enduring than conquest, the first Christian kingdom. History seldom grants small kingdoms the gift of peace. Armenia, placed at the very crossroads of empires, learned that faith could unite its people, but also mark them as prey. From the west pressed Byzantium, heir to Rome, armored in crosses but armored also in ambition. From the east surged the Sasanian Persians, zealous guardians of Zoroastrian fire. Between them, Armenia was less a sovereign than a battlefield, less a throne than a tug-of-war rope. Yet in this precarious place, Armenians clung not merely to land, but to faith. And faith, unlike territory, cannot be divided by treaty. The year was 451 AD. The Persians had demanded that Armenia abandon Christianity, to return to fire altars, to bend before the rituals of Mazda. But for the Armenians, faith had become not a religion only, but an identity, a way of being Armenian itself. To renounce it was to dissolve. And so, under the leadership of Vardan Mamikonian, they chose not submission, but defiance. This was the first movement of our wave, a proud, trembling rise of courage. Families gathered, nobles took oaths, priests blessed arms not for conquest, but for survival of the soul. Vardan spoke not of victory, but of loyalty to the cross. He was no Caesar promising empire, no Alexander boasting of horizons. He was a general prepared for martyrdom. And the people followed, not because they expected triumph, but because they feared the silence of forgetting their God. The armies met upon the plain of Avarair. The Persians came with elephants, with mailed horsemen, with the full arrogance of empire. The Armenians came with fewer numbers, with poorer weapons, but with crosses painted on their banners. The air filled with dust and prayer, hoof-beats and hymns. The battle was not evenly matched. The outcome, in worldly terms, was foregone. But in the language of faith, the terms were different. Here begins the second movement, martyrdom. Vardan and his companions fought fiercely, but they fell. Blood upon soil, cross upon corpse. To foreign eyes, it was a defeat. To Armenian memory, it was a sacrifice. Vardan became not a failed general, but a sainted commander, a witness that faith could be worth more than independence. His death turned loss into legend. Mothers told his name in lullabies. Churches painted him upon walls. Generations whispered, "He fell, so we might remain." The Persians claimed victory. The field was theirs, the dead many, the rebellion crushed. Yet what did they truly win? They won a land of ashes, but not the souls of those who walked among them. The Armenians, stripped of independence, kept their faith. In time, Persia would weary, Byzantium would return, borders would change, but the cross remained fixed. In this paradox, the final movement emerges, sacred endurance. It is strange, almost mystical, how a people can be conquered and yet undefeated, how chains can weigh on wrists but not upon belief. The sword may pierce flesh but not conviction. Armenia, after Avarayr, became a kingdom in exile within itself, politically broken, spiritually unbreakable. The church became the new throne, the priest the new general, the scripture the new law. And so faith preserved what politics had lost. Cinematically, the story feels like Braveheart, yet with a profound difference. Imagine the wide shots. A small army standing before a greater host, banners fluttering, chants rising. But instead of a warrior lifting a claymore, a priest lifts a cross. Instead of freedom shouted in the face of death, there is prayer whispered upon the lips of the dying. The tragedy is not less, the grandeur not smaller. It is simply of a different order, not the freedom of borders, but the freedom of the soul. In AOE2 terms, Armenia chose a strategy as strange as it is powerful. They sacrificed their Castle-Age armies to invest in monks. Imagine a player training fewer knights, fewer siege units, but sending forth robed monks, chanting, converting enemy soldiers to their cause. The economy suffers. The map control weakens. Yet spiritually, the civilization grows stronger. The conversion is risky. One misstep and the monks are slaughtered. But every success turns the enemy's strength into your own. That is Armenia's paradox, militarily vulnerable, spiritually invincible. So the wave of this chapter is clear. Defiance at Avarayr, where Armenians chose to fight for faith rather than bend to fire. Martyrdom in Vardan's fall, transforming loss into a sacred offering, and sacred endurance, where faith outlived empire, and Armenia became a nation less of land than of memory. As twilight falls upon the battlefield, the Persians carry their banners home, thinking they have won. But in villages, mothers rock children by firelight, whispering stories of Vardan the Brave. In monasteries, monks ink crosses on parchment. In mountains, Kachkars rise, each stone a silent vow. The kingdom is gone, the independence lost. Yet the nation remains. For Armenia had chosen the one throne no empire could seize, the throne of the heart. Centuries passed. Empires rose and collapsed like waves upon Armenia's rocky shore. Yet between the 9th and 11th centuries, there was a season unlike others, a season of light, a time Armenians still call their golden age. This was the era of the Bagratuni dynasty, when Armenia was not merely surviving between empires, but creating again. The Bagratunis rose in the 800s, when the Abbasid Caliphate, weary of distant rebellions, allowed Armenian nobles greater freedom. Out of this crack in the empire's armor, a kingdom was reborn. Ashot. I was crowned king in 885, and with him began a renaissance of politics, art, and spirit. The Armenians, long bowed by Persians, Byzantines, Arabs, now lifted their heads. For a moment, they were not pawns but players upon the board. The first movement of our wave is pure beauty. The new capital, Ani, earned the name City of 1001 Churches. Its skyline bristled with domes and arches, each carved with stone lace, each glowing with frescoes and mosaics. Travelers marveled that a people so often trampled could raise such splendor. Markets filled with silk from the east and wine from the valleys. Scholars debated theology and philosophy. Monks illuminated manuscripts with gold and lapis blue. To walk Ani's streets at sunset was to see a small kingdom dream as if it were an empire. The arts flourished because faith had endured. Churches were not merely houses of prayer, but statements that Armenia was alive, creative, defiant against obscurity. Architecture became scripture in stone. Every dome an echo of heaven, every khachkar a sermon carved in silence. In these centuries, the Armenians wrote their endurance not only in survival, but in beauty. Yet beauty invites envy. This is the second movement, betrayal. Armenia's golden age was framed by larger powers who smiled only when convenient. To the west, Byzantium, Christian but imperial, watched Ani with uneasy admiration. To the east, the rising Seljuk Turks pressed like a tide against borders. Armenia's geography, forever a blessing and curse, once again became a trap. Byzantine emperors courted Armenian nobles with titles, gold, and marriages, only to demand allegiance that eroded sovereignty. Internal rivalries among Armenian princes weakened the unity that beauty required. Ani glittered, but behind its domes lay fractures. And when the Seljuk advance gathered strength, the kingdom's walls would not be enough. The fall arrived with the speed of a storm. In 1064, the Seljuks under Alp Arslan besieged Ani. Chronicles recall blood in the streets, churches aflame, treasures looted. A city of light became a city of ash. To Armenians, it was not merely a military defeat. It was the loss of a dream, the shattering of their renaissance. Independence shrank, diaspora widened, memory wept. Yet, even in this fall, the sacred endurance of Armenia continued. The Bagratuni dynasty faded, but the art they had built remained. Ruins of Ani still stand today, silent yet eloquent, a testimony that beauty can outlast betrayal. The khachkars, scattered across valleys, whisper still of a time when Armenia dared not only to live, but to thrive. If cinema were to paint this chapter, it would be a tale of luminous rise and tragic betrayal. Imagine the sweeping camera across Ani's golden domes at dawn, the bustling markets alive with color and sound. Then, the siege begins. Drums thunder, walls tremble. The music shifts from strings to silence as the city burns. It is less gladiator and more Dr. Zhivago, beauty overwhelmed by history's cruelty, love betrayed by the march of empires. In AOE2 terms, the Bagratuni kings played a brilliant castle-age boom. They built wonders. Their economy flourished. Their map glittered with towers and monasteries. For a while, they seemed invincible, but they expanded with too much trust, too little unity. Byzantium, an ally one day, a rival the next. Seljuks, a distant rumor one year, a hammer the next. And when the imperial age storm of Turks arrived, Armenia's castles crumbled, not for lack of stone, but for lack of numbers and cohesion. So the wave of this chapter is clear. Beauty in Ani, where Armenia shone like a jewel of Christendom. Betrayal in the tug of Byzantium and the threat of Turks. Tragic fall in the Seljuk firestorm. Yet out of the ashes the memory endured. The ruins of Ani are not only ruins, they are a hymn in stone. They say, "We once built, we once dreamed, and even in ruin we remain. As night descends over Ani's broken arches, the moonlight touches carved crosses that no conqueror could erase. The Bagratuni kings are gone, their dynasty dissolved. But the stones still stand, patient, like Armenia itself. Empires crumble into dust. Beauty somehow survives. The fall of Ani was not the end, merely another turn in Armenia's long spiral of tragedy and renewal. What followed was harsher still. Centuries of rule beneath banners not their own, crescents and claws that cut across the highlands. Armenia, once radiant in Ani, now stood beneath the shadow of foreign empires. First the Mongols, later the Ottomans and Persians. The first movement of this chapter is devastation. In the 13th century, the Mongols thundered in from the east. Their riders, relentless as the wind of the steppe, burned villages, toppled fortresses, scattered monasteries. Chronicles tell of churches turned to stables, manuscripts trampled into mud, bells melted for weapons. For Armenians, who had survived Romans, Persians, Byzantines, this storm was different. It was not conquest with administration, but devastation without memory. Towns emptied. Monks fled to caves. The land grew quiet. Too quiet. Yet even devastation could be survived. Some Armenian nobles allied with Mongols to preserve a fragment of autonomy. Others fled to Cilicia on the Mediterranean coast, where the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia flourished for a brief time. It was here that Armenians mingled with crusaders, trading silk for steel, manuscripts for alliances. In Cilicia, the Armenians dreamed again, even crowned kings again. But Cilicia, too, would fall, first to the Mamluks, then to the Turks. Once more, Armenia scattered like seeds on the wind. This scattering brings the second movement. Dispersion. By the 15th century, Armenians were everywhere and nowhere. Villages dotted the Caucasus. Communities thrived in Aleppo, Constantinople, Isfahan. Merchants carried Armenian carpets to Venice, manuscripts to Krakow, prayers to Jerusalem. The people who once filled Ani now filled diaspora. The nation became less a territory than a network, woven in exile, sustained by memory, carried by faith. The Ottomans rose in the west, Persians in the east. Armenia was the land between, and thus always the prize, never the victor. The Ottoman millet system gave Armenians limited autonomy as a Christian minority. They built churches, tended vineyards, copied gospels. Outwardly, they were tolerated. Inwardly, they bore the weight of second-class status, of taxes heavier for their faith, of vulnerability to whims of rulers. Yet they endured again. To endure had become second nature, almost an instinct. But this endurance was not empty. It was creative. Armenian churches multiplied. Manuscripts filled libraries. Songs carried grief, yet also hope. The people turned inward to faith and culture when outward power was denied. The Kachkars multiplied in stone, each a declaration that we are still here. The third movement of our wave emerges. Quiet endurance. Not glory, not conquest, but survival that outlasts conquerors. Cinematically, these centuries would not be filmed as battles, but as montages. A candle burning in a dark church. A caravan moving westward under stars. A monk bent over parchment while soldiers ride past. A mother teaching her child to cross herself though the empire demanded silence. It is less Braveheart, more The Last Emperor. A story of survival in shadows. Beauty under oppression. Dignity without crown. In AOE2 terms, Armenia became like a civilization that had lost its castles and town centers, yet still had villagers hiding in corners of the map. No great armies, no imperial wonder, but quiet gathering of resources, slow rebuilding, waiting for time. Diaspora was like sending villagers to all corners, Venice, Persia, Poland, so that even if one base was destroyed, the civilization lived on. The Ottomans could dominate the map. Persians could tower over trade routes, but Armenians kept producing. Slowly, stubbornly, endlessly. The sin wave of this chapter is one of contrasts. Devastation under Mongols, when Armenia seemed extinguished. Dispersion under Turks and Persians, when Armenia spread outward yet remained intact. Endurance that defied centuries of subjugation. Night falls over ruined fortresses, over Annie's skeleton, over Cilicia's vanished throne. The crescent moon shines in Ottoman banners, but also upon quiet Armenian villages where candles flicker in stone chapels. The world thinks Armenia has been swallowed, yet in whispers, in manuscripts, in lullabies, the nation persists. The sword can burn, scatter, enslave. But the soul, once lit, cannot be extinguished. The centuries after the fall of Annie and the scattering of Cilicia were long, quiet, and heavy. Armenia no longer appeared on the maps of kings as a sovereign crown. Instead, it survived as a people without a kingdom, living under the shadow of others. For much of this time, the highlands belonged to the Ottoman Empire, vast and disciplined, where peoples were divided not by nations, but by millet, religious communities. Armenians became the Armenian millet, recognized as Christians, tolerated, taxed, watched. The first movement of this chapter is suppression. Under the millet system, Armenians were allowed their churches, their patriarch, their rituals. But these freedoms were wrapped in chains, heavy taxes on Christian subjects, limits on public expression, dependence upon the Sultan's will. An Armenian could build a chapel, but only in shadow. He could trade, but never fully prosper. He could speak his language at home, but power was spoken in Turkish. To be Armenian under the crescent was to walk with a weight upon the back, never crushed outright, but never free. And yet, in this twilight, Armenians discovered something paradoxical. The more the empire tried to contain them, the more they turned inward and preserved what mattered. Here begins the second movement, hidden strength. The church became not only a house of prayer, but a vault of memory. Manuscripts multiplied, copied in monasteries lit by oil lamps. The art of the Kachkar endured. Crosses carved into stone, each unique, each a defiance against forgetfulness. In markets, Armenian merchants grew skilled at trade, linking east and west, carrying silk and spice, wine and carpets, manuscripts and relics. Some rose to prominence even within the Ottoman system, trusted as bankers and advisors, though always under suspicion. Culture was not erased. It was preserved in whispers. Songs carried the sorrow of exile. Stories told of Annie's lost domes and Cilicia's vanished kings. Mothers rocked children with lullabies that were also lessons. We are Armenians. Do not forget. Faith became both shield and identity, language, a rope connecting scattered families. What the empire suppressed, the Armenians replanted deep, like roots beneath winter snow. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the world began to change. Europe stirred with nationalism, the idea that peoples deserved nations of their own. Greece fought for independence. The Balkans rose. In Armenia, too, the seed sprouted. priests began to speak of freedom, not just salvation. Writers composed in Armenian, awakening pride in a tongue nearly buried. Students studied abroad and returned with visions of modern nationhood. The long twilight, so silent for centuries, began to flicker with sparks. This is our third movement, Whispered Hope. It was hope still fragile, still dangerous. Ottoman rule did not soften. Persians still contested the highlands. To dream aloud was often to invite punishment. But once a people begin to imagine themselves free, no empire can fully silence them. The whispers in monasteries became discussions in villages, then pamphlets in cities. Independence was not yet near, but its possibility had entered the Armenian mind. Twilight was still heavy, but dawn was no longer unthinkable. Cinematically, this age would not be shown as battles or coronations, but as domestic scenes. A priest teaching letters to children in a candlelit corner. A mother embroidering patterns that carried centuries of symbolism. A merchant counting coins at dusk, thinking not only of trade but of his children's future. It would resemble Fiddler on the Roof. A people balancing faith and custom with the reality of oppression, forever negotiating between hope and survival. There is music, but it is bittersweet. There is laughter, but it is shadowed. Life goes on, hard, humble, resilient. In AOE2 terms, Armenia in this era resembled a civilization playing with no castles and little military, but with villagers quietly working behind the fog of war. Imagine a player locked into corners of the map, unable to build wonders, yet keeping mills, lumber camps, and monasteries alive. No great victories, no imperial marches, yet the civilization survives. And sometimes in AOE2 that is enough, to wait, to endure, to outlast until an ally arrives or an enemy collapses of its own weight. So, the wave of this chapter flows as follows. Suppression under the millet system, where Armenians lived but never thrived. Hidden strength, where churches, manuscripts, trade, and tradition preserved the nation. Whispered hope, where seeds of nationalism began to stir in the hearts of peasants and poets alike. Night falls again upon the highlands. Ottoman garrisons light their fires, Persian horsemen patrol their borders. And in small homes, Armenians whisper prayers in their own tongue, teach children their alphabet, sing songs of lands they have never seen but will never forget. The twilight is long, the oppression heavy. But the ember of hope glows, dim, hidden, yet unquenchable. For twilight, however endless, is only the hour before dawn. The 20th century dawned with promises of progress. Railways, telegraphs, parliaments, the murmur of reform. For Armenians within the Ottoman Empire, long years of twilight seemed as if they might yield to dawn. Schools multiplied, presses printed in Armenian, villages dreamed of equality at last. But the dawn that came was not of light. It was of fire and ash. In 1915, during the convulsions of the First World War, the Ottoman government turned its suspicion into policy. Armenians, accused of disloyalty, were marked as enemies within. The first movement of this chapter is horror. Men were arrested in towns and cities, intellectuals deported, community leaders silenced. Then the broader order came. Deportations. Families were driven from homes with nothing but what they could carry. Columns of Armenians, women, children, the elderly, were forced across deserts toward Syria without food, without water, without protection. Along those endless roads, many fell. some to exhaustion, some to hunger, some to violence. Villages emptied into death marches. Homes stood abandoned, fields untended, churches locked or destroyed. To those who walked, the world became reduced to dust, thirst, and the sound of feet that grew fewer each day. It was not only lives that were lost, it was homeland itself, the rhythm of seasons broken, the line of ancestors severed. The second movement is grief. Survivors carried not possessions but memories, of orchards now barren, manuscripts left behind, bells silenced. Songs turned to laments. A grandmother, rocking an orphan under a foreign roof, whispered not lullabies of mountains, but memories of a land the child would never see. Grief spread not only through those who walked, but through the diaspora that received them. From Beirut to Boston, from Aleppo to Paris, Armenian communities swelled with exiles. They brought tears, resilience, and the silence of a loss too great for words. And yet, even here, in the heart of ash, there was the faintest movement of endurance. Not triumph, not glory, not even hope, just the simple will to live. A child surviving a march became a living testament. A manuscript, hidden by monks, recovered decades later, became a relic of continuity. A song sung in exile became a thread that bound shattered families into one memory. The nation was wounded, scattered further than ever before, but not annihilated. Durant would remind us, history's tragedies are not measured only in numbers, but in silences. And this genocide left a silence that echoed across the world. It was a silence of villages gone, of voices unrecorded, of bells that would never ring again. A silence so deep that for decades many did not speak of it, and many outside did not listen. It was, in truth, a silence in world history, a wound that shaped not only Armenia, but humanity's conscience. Cinematically, the story would not be filmed as spectacle. It would be filmed in whispers and absences, an empty church with doors ajar, a child's shoe left in dust, a mother's lullaby fading into silence. The camera would linger not on battles, but on emptiness. Fields without farmers, streets without voices, mountains without villages. It would be a film of absence, of shadows, of what is no longer there. In AOE 2 terms, this moment is like the near-total destruction of a civilization. Imagine a player who loses nearly all villagers, whose town centers burn, whose armies vanish. Yet, in a far corner of the map, one or two villagers remain, gathering wood, quietly existing. To the world, it seems the civilization has been defeated. But those who know the game know. So long as a single villager lives, the civilization endures. So it was with Armenia, crushed, scattered, but not erased. So the wave of this chapter is clear. Horror in the deportations and massacres of 1915. Grief in the loss of homeland, in the scattering of families, in the silence of memory. And the faintest endurance, the whisper of survival that would keep Armenia alive even in exile. Night falls over the highlands, over roads littered with silence. The empire that carried out the destruction will itself collapse with the war, vanishing into history. But the Armenians, though broken, remain. In every orphan, in every manuscript saved, in every diaspora church built in exile, the nation continues. The fire sought to consume them. The ash sought to bury them. But within the ash, an ember still glowed, fragile, dim, but alive. And from that ember, Armenia would rise again. The First World War had ended not in triumph, but in ashes for the Armenians. From the genocide, from exile, from collapse, came a brief flicker of independence in 1918, the First Republic of Armenia. It was fragile, small, beset by hunger and enemies. Yet, for a short breath of history, Armenians raised their own flag again upon their mountains. It was a moment of hope. But the 20th century was no gentler than the centuries before. In 1920, the Red Army marched south. Armenia, like Georgia and Azerbaijan, was incorporated into the newly born Soviet Union. The brief independence ended, and a new chapter began. The first movement of our wave is that very hope, which Soviet Armenia at first seemed to offer. Roads were built. Factories rose. Literacy campaigns spread across villages. For the first time in generations, industry hummed in Yerevan. Electricity lit streets, railways carried goods. Children who once learned in candlelit monasteries now studied in modern schools. For peasants, modernization promised bread. For workers, it promised stability. After centuries of poverty and ruin, the Soviet order looked like salvation. But every salvation carried its own chains. Soon came the second movement. Control. The Soviet state suppressed the church, that ancient refuge of Armenian spirit. Monasteries closed, priests silenced, sacred manuscripts hidden. Faith, once the soul of identity, was now treated as superstition, dangerous to the collective future. The Armenian Apostolic Church survived, but only in the shadows, watched and restricted. Nationalism, too, was muted. To speak too openly of Armenian independence, to dream of Mount Ararat as homeland rather than symbol, was to risk exile to Siberia. Stalin's purges did not spare Armenia. Intellectuals disappeared. Whispers replaced open speech. The state gave Armenia schools, but also censored its textbooks. Gave Armenia theaters, but scripted their plays. Gave Armenia factories, but demanded their workers praise Moscow. And yet, even under this control, Armenians found ways to endure, and even to create. This is our third movement, resilience in silence. In universities, scholars preserved the Armenian language, teaching it even as Russian-dominated public life. In theaters, plays hinted at ancient pride under the guise of folklore. In homes, mothers still taught children to cross themselves at night, though the church doors were locked. Musicians played komitas. Poets wrote of mountains. Artists painted Ararat, never openly as politics, but always as memory. The Soviet regime sought to mold Armenians into a piece of its machinery. Instead, Armenians carved small spaces within the machine to remain themselves. The paradox of Soviet Armenia was this: it destroyed independence, yet it also preserved Armenia from disappearance. By incorporating the Republic, Moscow gave Armenia defined borders, a capital in Yerevan, resources for survival. For the first time in centuries, Armenians had a state recognized on maps, even if not their own in spirit. In this strange captivity, identity persisted. Cinematically, this story would not be a war epic, but a quiet drama. The camera would move from Yerevan's factories at dawn, smokestacks against the sky, to a village home where an old woman secretly lights a candle before an icon hidden in a cupboard. It would show schoolchildren reciting Lenin by day, but singing Armenian folk songs by night. It would be less gladiator than the lives of others, a tale of art and survival under watchful eyes, of resilience disguised as conformity. In AOE2 terms, Soviet Armenia was like a civilization playing in a team game. The Armenians were not the main power. They could not choose their own strategy. They gathered resources, built villagers, contributed to the collective. Moscow, the Allied team leader, decided when to attack, when to defend, when to trade. Armenia survived not by standing alone, but by attaching itself to the larger banner. And yet, within the team, it kept its own color, its own villagers, its own quiet prayers. So the wave of this chapter moves. Hope, in the modernization and education that lifted Armenia from centuries of poverty. Control, in the suppression of church and spirit, the censorship of thought, the silencing of independence, and, finally, resilience in silence, in the ways Armenians found to remain themselves under Soviet rule. Night falls on Yerevan. The factories quiet, the streets darken, the mountain of Ararat stands across the closed border, visible yet unreachable. Within apartments, families whisper in Armenian, tell stories of Ani, Silecha, Vardan, and Tigran. The empire above them is vast, powerful, seemingly eternal. But Armenia, small and quiet, endures. Patient, waiting, surviving under another's banner. For the Armenians have learned the oldest lesson of their history. Empires pass, but the soul of a people remains. The 20th century ended as it had begun, with empires collapsing. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, and in its rubble many old nations found new life. For Armenians, long suppressed, long silent, the day of independence arrived. The tricolor flag rose over Yerevan, and with it came tears, prayers, and a surge of pride. After centuries of twilight, Armenia was reborn as a state. The first movement of our wave is rebirth. Factories, once owned by Moscow, now belonged to Yerevan. Schools taught openly of Armenian kings and martyrs. Churches reopened. Bells rang freely for the first time in 70 years. In Republic Square, citizens celebrated beneath fireworks, believing at last that history's burden had lifted. Independence was not a dream, but a fact. For a moment, Armenia felt as if it had stepped out of the shadows of others, into its own sun. But rebirth, like all in Armenian history, carried trials. The second movement is struggle. The region of Nagorno-Karabakh, historically Armenian but placed within Azerbaijan by Soviet decree, became the flashpoint. War erupted in the 1990s. Armenian fighters, poorly armed, often volunteers, faced larger forces with determination born of centuries of survival. The mountains became fortresses. Villages became trenches. Victory was partial, bitter, costly, thousands dead, cities scarred, a fragile ceasefire holding but never resolving. The 21st century brought new wars in 2016 and 2020, when Azerbaijan, backed by oil wealth and allies, struck again. Armenia, smaller and weaker, resisted fiercely but lost ground. Karabakh, long defended at unimaginable cost, slipped partly away. For Armenians, it was a cruel reminder. Independence did not mean security. Sovereignty did not mean peace. The struggle continued. And yet, as always, Armenia endured. Here begins the third movement, enduring hope. Despite poverty, despite war, despite borders closed by Turkey and Azerbaijan, Armenia nurtured its identity. Diaspora communities across the world carried Armenian names, voices, and stories into new contexts. In Hollywood, stars like Cher reminded the world of Armenian roots. Writers like William Saroyan wove exile into art. In Silicon Valley, entrepreneurs of Armenian descent built technologies that reshaped the globe. In Paris, Moscow, Los Angeles, Beirut, Armenian churches and schools flourished, keeping memory alive. The nation was no longer bounded only by geography. It existed in millions of exiles, each carrying Mount Ararat in their imagination. That mountain, now lying just beyond modern Armenia's borders, became the eternal symbol, visible from Yerevan, yet unreachable, a reminder of loss and of longing, but also of permanence. Ararat stood as it always had, indifferent to empires, patient with nations, constant as a compass for identity. Cinematically, this chapter feels like an unfinished epic. Imagine a film where the hero survives countless battles, gains independence, but finds new wars waiting, new uncertainties unresolved. The screen fades not to triumph or despair, but to continuity. Faces of Armenians across the world, candles in Yerevan, Ararat rising against the dawn. It is less a conclusion than a reflection. The story is not over. It never was. Armenia exists between survival and dream, always. In AOE2 terms, independence was like advancing finally into the imperial age after centuries of feudal survival. Town centers rebuilt, castles raised again, monks rang their bells. Yet neighboring players were stronger, with more resources, more allies. Armenia fought bravely in the team battles, sometimes winning villages back, sometimes losing castles, but always staying in the game. And in team games, survival itself can shape the outcome. Armenia remained smaller but unresigned, contributing its color to the great map. So the wave of this chapter is clear. Rebirth in 1991 independence, the joy of self-rule restored. Struggle in the wars over Karabakh, the cost of survival in a hostile neighborhood, and enduring hope in diaspora strength, in cultural resilience, in the eternal presence of Ararat. Night falls over Yerevan. Lights shimmer in cafes, in churches, in homes where families tell stories of Tigran the Great, of Ani, of Avarer, of Cilicia, of the genocide, of Soviet silences. Outside the city, Ararat rises, silent, majestic, eternal. The mountain says nothing. It has seen empires pass, peoples scatter, nations rise and fall. But it remains. And so, too, does Armenia. The story does not end here. It cannot. For Armenia is not a closed book, but a flame carried forward, sometimes dim, sometimes bright, but never extinguished. It is a civilization always between survival and dream, a song unfinished, an epic without final line. History is often written as a tale of victors, of empires that conquer, kings that reign, battles that decide the fate of continents. Yet Armenia's story reminds us that history is also the tale of those who endure. For more than 3,000 years, on mountains and in valleys, in exile and in homeland, Armenians have carried forward their flame. Empires rose around them like waves. Assyria, Persia, Rome, Byzantium, Ottomans, Soviets, each proclaiming themselves eternal, each fading into memory. Armenia, small and fragile, remained. This survival is not measured in territory. It is measured in faith, in culture, in the quiet resilience of families who taught their children to remember. It is carved in khachkars, weathered by centuries. It is sung in folk songs that carry grief, yet end in hope. It is seen in the silhouette of Mount Ararat, which has watched the people for millennia, sometimes near, sometimes across borders, but always present. In the sweep of this history, the Armenian story is more than national. It is human. It tells us that greatness is not only in conquest, but in endurance. That even when kingdoms vanish, a people may survive through memory and spirit. That identity can live without empire. That hope can smolder through centuries of twilight. That culture can become stronger than armies. And perhaps this is why Armenia speaks to us still, because all nations in their own way are fragile. All peoples face the weight of history, the shadow of larger powers, the risk of being forgotten. To listen to Armenia's story is to remember that survival itself can be victory, that memory is a form of resistance, that hope is stronger than despair. Cinematically, the story ends not with a final battle or coronation, but with an open horizon. The camera lingers on Ararat at dawn, the light soft upon its snow. The valleys below alive with voices, churches, markets, children. The music swells not in triumph, but in endurance. The epic is not complete. It continues, for Armenia is not only its past, it is its present, its diaspora, its future. It is in Yerevan's crowded streets, in Los Angeles neighborhoods, in Parisian cafes, in Beirut churches. It is in the voices of poets, the hands of craftsmen, the songs of choirs. It is in each Armenian heart that remembers, and in each listener who learns their story. And so, as we close this journey, let us carry one thought. Civilizations are not only measured by what they built or lost, but by what they remembered. Armenia, against all odds, remembered. And because it remembered, it survived. If you have walked with me through these chapters, through Urartu and Ani, through Avarayr and Cilicia, through fire and ash, through silence and hope, then let this not be an ending but a beginning. For history is alive only when we share it, when we pass it onward, when we keep the flame from going out. So, if this story has moved you, if it has taught you something, if it has made you pause and reflect, then I invite you to stay with us, to join the journey ahead. There are more civilizations to explore, more forgotten voices to remember, more lessons from the past waiting to speak. Let us walk into the next story, together. And if you wish to walk with us, then please consider subscribing, so you will not miss the next chapter of history's long and unfinished epic.